Radio. Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Wow, that was random. Exceptional Radio. Hey, good evening. It's the 13th of August, and we've had a pretty interesting past few days. But tonight we're going to be talking about a few, more pressing matters like personal health and the concepts of the nation, community, and the people. And we've got our special guest tonight is our own Dennis Chalders. He's been on the show several times in the past, and we are very happy to have him with us tonight. So to get things started, there's a powerlifting champion who broke both of his knees trying to lift 900 pounds. 900 fucking pounds. Holy shit. And in the process, he managed to destroy the connective tissues in his legs. And, there's a good chance he might never walk. Well, he might never walk right, but he might never walk again. And he's probably going to experience a, pretty considerable amount of pain for the rest of his life. So we got to consider, the balance of the body and how that's thrown off when people who are highly athletic stop working out all the time, stop exercising. You get this kind of imbalanced atrophy that occurs when people who are used to training regularly just can't.
Well, and then this whole notion of powerlifting is relatively modern in that it's not that there weren't methods of weightlifting or strongmen or feats of strength before modern times, but the notion of how we do powerlifting now, it's so horrifically without purpose that this is how you end up with somebody lifting 900 pounds and tearing both of their knees seemingly for no reason. I mean,
Chris just popped into my head what I was just thinking, man. Like, it's commodified, right? Like, talked about how ancient cultures would do feats of strength in the past, and it was always related to what their culture could do. And it made me just think of, what's the actor's name? He's Icelandic. Hafþór Bjornsson. There was a legend of a Viking that pulled a ship for a little bit because he had to, right? And he ended up, the legend that he did it, but he broke his back. And Hafþór Bjornsson did a similar feat in the modern era, but it was plugged back into what his ancestors did. And just, wow, like you're right, Chris, like, why are we doing this now? Do we have to do these things anymore?
Yeah, and then when when there's this cultural reference or deference in making that sacred, I sincerely doubt he got paid for that feat, but when he's doing that to give reverence to his ancestors and their traditions and that story, that's something completely different than somebody who's powerlifting to get sponsorship for a protein shake or something that is not the steroids that got that person to the powerlifting stage.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly my point. Like, do you do this simply climb the mountain, so to speak, or do you do this to get to make money? Which
Well,
is, yeah.
you mentioned Hafthor Bjornsson, and I believe he competed for the world's strongest man competition.
Yeah, a few times. Yeah.
Yeah, so that brings me to think about the entire concept of the world's strongest man competition. When I was in high school and in middle school a little bit, I would watch on the ESPN alternative sports channel the reruns as well as some of the new world's strongest man competitions. And even today, I believe we still have them, or up until recently, they would still go on. And a lot of the events are lifting large boulders, the Atlas stones, lifting them onto pillars, lifting up
Farmers.
vehicles. There was even a competition or an event where it was like a tug of war between contestants. And if that in and of itself is becoming a vehicle for making money or for economic advancement, we also want to consider, how are people putting their bodies at risk in order to generate these spectacles? Whereas
it wasn't at first, and this is one of the important discussions about that that contest, because originally, as you're talking about in the early days, there was no real money involved. It was basically for the acclaim and for the title. It was almost exclusively for the title, down to the point that the people that were winning didn't even really get any sort of sponsorships, or there wasn't a whole lot of interest in the World's Strongest Man events until Mark Henry became a WWF at the time, I believe, wrestler. And it was really the WWF that made the World's Strongest Man a spectacle money-making event. So as you're saying, yeah, it was what it was originally was not what it is today. So let's not confuse, it's absolutely a money-making capitalist exploitative endeavor today. But what it was taking the place of those traditional displays of strength, down to having all of the events basically be giving reverence to those cultures. So that's kind of why, again, it's like what it was originally meant to be versus what it is now are two completely different things. And I think that's where
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that being traditionally trained, I wasn't so good as kendo as I was jujutsu, but the dojo and the tradition that I came from, and learning about kendo, for example, kendo still refuses to be an Olympic sport, because even though it isn't kenjutsu like it traditionally used to be, and it morphed into kendo post World War II, they don't want money involved in it. And it kind of comes down to, sometimes you see how, kind of hate to say it, but no, I don't hate to say it. Capitalism could break anything. And we're kind of seeing that now.
2 recessions within the last 20 years. I'm pretty sure capitalism isn't working.
Yeah, right. Like not working. And to keep it out of whatever martial tradition, whether it be a Western one or an Eastern one, that wants to keep money out of it, where you compete solely to just, like Chris had said, gain the title, to earn it, and not have your sports drinks and your whey protein sponsorships, will eventually lead to, the unfortunate event. It's like, oh, you blew out both your knees to the point where you cannot potentially walk ever again. Because at least in my experience, both military and being a martial artist, you're obviously trained to know what you can do and what you can't do, and to have the honor and integrity. Like, I'm not even going to try that. But when you add this sort of cutthroat capitalist mentality to the mix and like eliminate the restraints of your tradition, whatever it is from, oh, I'm going to try this anyway. It just leads to disaster.
Yeah, and it's that risk entertainment that leads to these, both knees being blown out. And that's the type of scenario where if that person was doing it for the sake of proving something to themselves, they would not, I don't think that they would blow out their knees. Where when you get this element of you're trying to prove something, but then there's this promise of potential monetary gain that could potentially make you set for life if you just lift enough weight, just break that one record, you just get that one sponsorship because you did this one deadlift, and it puts these imaginary constructs in these people's heads, and they start chasing this dragon because one time in history Jay Cutler became famous, or Ronnie Coleman became famous, and they made some money off of it, and they think that they can attain the same thing or whatever. But in the process, they're willing to destroy their entire bodies and their futures for the sake of that one thing. Excuse me. And in the process, we all know now that it's a mental a lot of these guys have, I mean, not the powerlifters necessarily, because the powerlifters aren't doing this for physique, but there's an intersection where it's the people who are doing it for sponsorship, effectively, is what it comes down to. They're chasing dollars to do it. And it just happens to be because they're intersecting with weightlifters that are builders rather, or physique sculptors, that the dysmorphia is something that exists in both. Because it's not that powerlifters don't have body dysmorphia either. They definitely do. They just don't have the same type of body dysmorphia as the bodybuilders. So it's there. It's just different.
As an aside, Ronnie Coleman appears to have had over a dozen surgeries on his spine and hips combined.
Oh,
yeah, they never really.
Wow.
In that.
Wow.
Ronnie Coleman is a shell of his former self. He tries to lift still. It's sad that his dysmorphia won't let him just stop lifting, because he's just destroying his body. I mean, most of them do. I don't know if anybody's watched Generation Iron, or what was the first one?
I watched Ronnie's documentary.
Iron was the first one. Then there was Generation Iron, I think, was the most recent one. But there's three documentaries. The first one was with the one starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, that everybody always thinks about when they think of bodybuilding documentaries. And then the second one had Kai Green and Phil Davis, I believe, and I think Jay Cutler might have been in there in the most recent.
That's Lou Ferrigno is an interesting case study, because you look at him and people don't realize him to scale how much larger, just naturally,
right,
outside of bodybuilding, how much bigger Lou Ferrigno as a human being was to those around him. I mean, I grew up, to show my age, I remember watching The Incredible Hulk as a child, when it ran on television. And I didn't really grasp, right? How big he was. Oh, he was the Incredible Hulk, right? Yeah, you grasp that. But then when you see him years later in pictures with people like Arnie or other bodybuilders, and there was a recent picture that's been circulating around social media of a modern-ish bodybuilder. He is tiny compared to Ferrigno.
There's a classic image of Lou Ferrigno and Flavio Bacchiani, and
that's it. Thank you, Tien.
Flavio's barely up to the middle of Lou's pec, like just above the nipple. That's how tall this guy is compared to Lou. And so Lou is truly the Hulk in this. Like, it's
He was massive, and no amount of juice or steroids or supplements or money will get you there. All right, like it's
definitely juice, bro. He juiced to the fucking gills.
yeah. Well, yeah, there is that.
He was on all of the juice, man. Come on, him and but this is where it's like he was also naturally big as to why in his older age he's not falling apart like a lot of those older guys, or not the older guys, but the other guys rather, because I think he's older than Ronnie Coleman, if I'm not mistaken.
He's older than Ronnie Coleman. It's also important to note that Lou Ferrigno, Arnold Schwarzenegger, other bodybuilders who have had measures of commercial success have had access to immediate palliative and medical care and physical therapy regimens that could have even been subsidized by the organizations that were sponsoring them.
Oh, excellent point.
And that could actually prevent them from degrading at a faster rate.
Oh my God! It's when I was, okay. If you guys can help remember, I was still in the Marine Corps when it was either one of the former Oakland Raiders, I think it was maybe Alzado, had a massive coronary. And I was a huge Oakland fan when I was a kid, right? Like I was way back to like Ken Stabler and then Jim Plunkett as a little kid. And then like watching their front line, these dudes were massive, right? And you're like, why are they so freaking big? And then when the 90s roll around and I'm an adult, right, and I'm paying attention, like a couple of the Raiders front linemen started to massively have health problems. And it was like, was it Matuzak or Alzado that died of a massive coronary directly because of steroid use? Which goes back to like, wow, you did this so you could be a better lineman, so you could make more money and get a better contract.
Now he's dead. And that's like, I don't know if you remember Any Given Sunday, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And then the program sort of explored it as well, but in the context of college football. And then Blue Chips explored it in the context of basketball, because a lot of those basketball players are on roids too. And what's crazy is, man, the culture has changed so much. I want to say half the people in my high school sports were on steroids. Like,
wow.
Because that's when you have the Bash brothers when Mark McGuire was on roids with Jose Canseco, he was small.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He was a big dude then, and he was already on roids. And then he started getting on that andro and probably some human growth hormone and all kinds.
Probably doing Dianabol stacks, right?
Yeah, and then Barry Bonds' head started to blow up. Barry Bonds' head did not grow on its own. Barry Bonds real.
Man, I actually
stop growing.
I lived in the Bay Area when the A's were on top, and when San Francisco, the Giants were like the team to beat. And I mean, I remember when Barry Bonds was traded to the Giants, and he wasn't big back then when he left Pittsburgh.
He had a normal sized head.
Yeah, he was completely proportional back then. So and well, I can't say that Jose was ever proportional. He always seemed like he had a tiny head. But even in the early days, Mark McGuire was like a proportional looking dude. He might have been juicing then, but not to the point that it got once he went to St. Louis?
Well, I think it's only in your head like that because Jose was so abnormally juiced to the gills next to him. And that's where it's like, we didn't realize Mark was juicing back then because Jose was just like, oh, give me all the fucking steroids. And that's when he was like,
no, I mean, I remember seeing them on the field, like when you.
Sorry, go ahead.
when you see like Mark
Well,
McGuire standing next
and
to
here's
other players, like he was big. He was always a big dude, but the difference between Mark McGuire in the '80s at Oakland and Mark McGuire in St. Louis, it's like a different fucking dude. Like a complete. I remember seeing him in that Cardinals uniform, and he's like, "That's not Mark McGuire."
that's not the same dude, right?
Requires dead, bro.
Yeah, well, and here's a crazy perspective of being into cycling since the early '90s, and even racing for like a literal 5 minutes. I've been in one race, and watching the cycling world go through this now. Obviously, it's not anabolic steroids; it's oxygen boosting
Oh yeah,
drugs
blood
that
doping.
are EPO and what was called doping, or doing things like they would bank their own blood, right? And literally a day or two before the race would get a transfusion of their own blood
Mhm.
to have extra red blood cells. And it was like the weird, crazy shit
Mhm.
that cyclists would do. And I only started paying attention to it when I was in my mid 20s, and then realizing when you research it, you go back, that racers as far back as the 40s, there was an Italian, Fausto Coppi, and I'll never forget this quote, and I'm going to get it as close as I can remember it. He's like, if a cyclist doesn't tell you he doesn't use an amphetamine or some sort of drug, is lying or he's insane. And it's killed people in the Tour de France. There was a British rider, specifically English. I believe his name was Simpson. I think it was on the Galabert climb. He was on an amphetamine of some variety, and he literally fell off the bike. And he told the spectators to put him back on the bike. I think his exact words, "Put me back on the bloody bike." They put him on there. He made it another few hundred yards. He fell again and died. And then they found out he was on some sort of stimulant. And this is leading into the whole Lance Armstrong, and it was specifically with him, it was EPOs. And it was like, going back to what Chris has said about this financial factor, it used to be the tour it was for the fame and just the name. And even then, they sadly did too many, quote, performance enhancing drugs, which exacted too much of a cost. And then they got slick doctors. They got slick lawyers to cover their tracks, but it was still exacting a cost. And cyclists have died.
Performance enhancing drugs and steroids in particular have found themselves in other sports as well, especially competitive fighting. There are MMA fighters who are known for using steroids or have been caught by various athletic regulatory commissions for using performance enhancing drugs. And I believe that there have been some modifications to some of the oversights or some of the expectations for the allowance of performance enhancing drugs of certain types, like testosterone replacement therapy or things like that. Or at least there was a period of time where there was a respite from the monitoring, and there were several fighters who took advantage of that and saw substantial gains in muscle mass and bone density, as well as overall athleticism and capacity.
Yeah, because they're saying a lot of these changes have lasting effects on the bone structure and density, which, when you examine the actual records of people in non-bike related sports who use steroids, they don't actually necessarily have a more successful performance record. But then what ends up happening is in biking, the whole reason I excluded biking is everyone was doping. So there's like no way to compare it against people who weren't doping because
Oh my God. Chris, it's funny that you say that. When the UCI, the governing body of cycling, vacated when Lance got basically finally popped, right? Being a close fan and being also a participant in amateur bicycling, I was always aware. They vacated the Tour de France committee, vacated the victories. There, if you look at the official records of the Tour de France for like 7 years, there is no winners because everybody in the top, I think 10 to 20 in the field, were either implicated or popped positive for a oxygen boosting drug or some other performance enhancing drug. And they're just like, we're done. This is so terrible and so rampant that nobody won the Tour de France this block.
Yeah, there was actually a documentary that a guy did. I forget the name of it off the like right now. But it's like he started off the documentary to find out if somebody could win one of these bike races without doping or using steroids. And in the process, he ends up starting to do steroids and starting to dope. And that was like how the whole USADA scandal got discovered, was because of this dude's documentary. It was like, obviously Lance was like the whole issue, but there was a scandal in which there was like I think it was the Russian team had figured out a way to open up the samples, and then like, yeah, because this is why Russians have gotten banned from a lot of sports. Actually, they figured out a way to open up the samples and then insert clean samples into the container.
Wow.
Because what ended up happening was the samples in the containers had been fucked with before, so they made these containers so that when you seal them the first time, it creates a seal that if you break it, it should be visible that it has been broken. But what happened was the Russian team figured out a way to break those seals and reseal them without it appearing broken, and that's how they were getting around the system. And there were people inside who were involved with helping them get around. So there was like this whole scandal about that got discovered basically by this dude accidentally. I mean, he says it was accidental, but in the process.
Yeah, that's a bunch of bullshit.
Exactly.
Hey, was the documentary called Lance or Stop at Nothing?
Well, here's the thing with Lance's story, right? He had an incredibly talented but diabolic Italian physician that was using the acronym is EPO, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but they're oxygen boosting drugs. He was on the cutting edge of experimenting with different versions of that drug that could not be detected at the time, or masking them in such a way that they couldn't. And even before him, there was a controversy. Oh, what was that French team? Festina, I think. They literally got caught at a European border with vials and syringes in the team fucking car, and then tried to like bullshit their way out of it, but it didn't work, obviously, and they got booted out for a while. Like, it's
actually, because the one I was thinking of was called Icarus, and that I think what you're describing was actually part of how they were also doping. And this was a whole thing. He like literally accidentally, I mean, again, as far as he says, he wasn't undercover placed, but it kind of seems like he was an undercover. But regardless, this motherfucker accidentally discovers one of the biggest doping scandals since Lance Armstrong.
Oh, it's sadly been rampant in cycling for decades. And it finally got, I mean, to be fair, it's ebbed and flowed, right? Like there have been periods where cyclists haven't, like, because it didn't really work out for them, because you notice times are slower, right? But like it's just nuts. Like the what was the Italian, Marco Pantani? He was a tragic story because he was a rising star, and I believe he ended up having cocaine issues, right? That was another drug that was sort of popular among that sort of elite cycling world. And I'm like, wow, you guys just need to stop. You're killing yourselves.
So, just as an aside, EPO, we've learned, stands for erythropoietin. And
thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
It was provided by the Rando team. It wasn't just me, but thank you. It's a hormone that can be synthesized in a lab that stimulates red blood cell production, and hence it can increase endurance when used or injected intravenously.
Well, there were stories, and I had even heard, not racers at my level, but above my level, about how people would take EPO and how it would thicken the blood, right? And they would have to literally wake up the person or the team that they were dosing at 2 or 3 in the morning when they were sleeping, wake up. They'd literally either go run or go bike or go like low weight, high rep lifting so they wouldn't basically die. And I'm like, at what point do you guys not get what you're doing is not dangerous to the body?
Well, you bring up a fantastic point to discuss the psychology of competitive sports, to discuss the psychology of the people who are trying to achieve or attain a high level of proficiency or have this view of perfection. It could be similar to the dysmorphia that Chris described, that is found in some people who pursue bodybuilding actively as a profession, or even as just a personal mode of physical development. But we can explore and try to better understand the impetus for somebody enduring those types of changes and additions to their bodies in order to have the accolade as well as the monetary support or the monetary result or the prestige or the status on a global scale and what comes with that. You know, it could be a social thing. It could be a social impetus. It could be a financial one as well. So,
for the record, the series was Pumping Iron, then Pumping Iron 2, Generation Iron, or Bigger, Stronger, Faster, then Generation Iron, and then Generation Iron 2, because this is like a series that, Lou Ferrigno is in the beginning, and then his son is in the later ones, I believe, which also includes him, and it shows the progression of not only the individuals but the scene. So you see how in the early days, even down to Arnold, there was actually a lot. I mean, even though Arnold was getting deals from it, it was a lot more about fun in those early days, to the point where they have documentary proof of it. There's no question. It's not lore, it's not legend. This is what those documentaries are proving, in that in modern times there's no fun to it. It's a job. These people are knowingly killing themselves to try to win these titles, and then when they don't, they feel like abject failures for coming in second to the first place people. And in the process, all they do is harp on their imperfections in their bodies the entire year, basically starve themselves of any joy, spend all of their time in the gym, have very little social interaction or relationships. And you see how this is actually a huge mental disorder. So it's not even really glorifying in the process, because they're showing you all of the terrible aspects of it and all of the downsides and all of the times that people flip out and have their roid rage episodes. They're not shying away from any of that, which is why when I'm talking about it, I don't like it. If anything, it made me definitely not want to ever go anywhere near that type of approach to bodybuilding. But that wasn't even what I was anticipating the result to be from watching the films. Like, you go in not knowing what to expect, but if anything, like I said, those things were lessons in how bodybuilding is a mental disorder in the most extreme forms.
Well, yeah, you definitely peeled back. I remember I got into weightlifting in the Marine Corps, and I'm a small guy. I've never been a big dude. I had to just lift for strength. And what I had to define what was strong for me was different than a dude that was like at a base 250 to 300 pounds strong, right? And starting to tap into the culture briefly, like, okay, human man, some people will argue, what is it, 5 or 6% is the low end of what you can be as a man, healthy, body fat. And watching some of these guys through video, I didn't know anybody that competed in person, but dropped down to 4 or 5% consistently and be dehydrated as shit and have paper thin skin and not enough fat in their diet to absorb certain vitamins and minerals. And just seeing how strangely, even though it was in the perfection or in the quest of perfection for health, ideally, right? Like in name, they were slowly killing themselves. And I'm like, I don't want to be that person. I am not that person.
Well, and what you're saying, I remember getting the magazines when I was a kid and reading the workouts, and you do all these workouts and you find the supplements that they're suggesting in there, and you're like, why am I not looking like these guys? And it makes you feel like you're doing something wrong until you find out about the steroids, and you're like, oh, this is why. This is
yeah. Well, that's it right there. Yeah.
So, once I was fortunate enough, I will never forget, I read a story in one of the muscle fitness and magazines about somebody who was doing a show, and he was posing in the mirror before the actual event, and apparently all of his muscles froze up and he like got stuck in a pose. And this is like something that can actually happen because of, as you're saying, they basically put their bodies in the worst possible shape, even though we've been told that they look like what a sculpted body is supposed to look like. They're actually in terrible shape. Their organs are on the verge of failure. They're so dehydrated that it's possible, if someone flexes for too hard for too long, that they can get stuck. And apparently, if they get stuck in the wrong position, it can actually cause them to either suffocate or go into cardiac arrest, because their muscles can't contract properly, so they can't get enough oxygen to their heart. So there's all this shit that when you find out that that's a possible side effect from being like too muscular, but they don't talk about that shit on Conan the Barbarian. They don't talk about that shit on Game of Thrones. They just want you to see the dude's muscles and see the abs and see the ripped, shredded person, and not see when they're off screen that person is actually on the verge of death because you
yeah,
have that low body fat percentage. when you're
To be fair, and an example, Chris, you brought up, as a 20 something watching Mark Henry was always sort of an impressive dude to me because he wasn't sculpted, right? Like he wasn't, and that's when I realized like the sort of what a strongman is different than what a bodybuilder is, right? Like Hopfjord Bjornsson, when you really look at him, he's not ripped. I mean, he's big, he's healthy, but he's not ripped. And this whole idea of this sort of like super lean, super big guy, God, it's so goddamn dangerous. It really is.
and there's one specific person who originated this concept, and fuck Joe Weider.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's a piece of shit. And you can go look this up. There is no question as to where this came from, because if you go look at strongman images before Joe Weider, it looks like now where we're past the steroid shit. It used to look natural. It used to look like somebody's probably got like 6 to 8% body fat that's not starving themselves before a shoot, that looks like they could actually do what they're being shown to be doing on film if you know what happens on or behind the scenes on the weightlifting sets. So that's where, or the bodybuilding event scenes, and that's where there isn't a huge element of keeping people out of the know to keep up the appearance of this image for bodybuilders, because as you're saying, once you realize that like, oh, the actual strongmen look like Mark Henry, they look like Hopthor Bjornsson, like they're not ripped. Like an actual strong, like a ripped person is devoid of nutrients and energy to actually sustain their muscles firing at 100% capacity without breaking down. And this is why when we're talking about the super lean person as not representing the strong man or strong woman, that's because physically that's a person who's at 2% body fat is not going to be able to perform in the same capacity as that same person at 6% or 8% body fat. And that's just a fact. We have definitive proof in the Olympics and all these sports over history. It's like there is a threshold at which not having enough fat impedes your performance.
Well, every time some or some person wants to swim across the English Channel, when they get in the water, they're a little bit thick, and when they get out, it looks like they're wearing a skin suit.
Yeah, right. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, because they burn off all that fat. You know, I take a protein supplement with a shake in the morning. It's got oatmeal, a whey protein. I put some ginger and cinnamon in it. It tastes like strawberries. I add coffee as well. I'm not getting all big and bulked out, but I'm also not taking steroids.
Bingo. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, and it's, you think too, like, you look at how warriors from the ancient times to now are built. Martial artists, the ones that obviously don't juice or do it for competition, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but for those outside, they do not look the same. Every once in a while, if they're of a lean nature, yes, they're ripped. But I remember seeing judo players, man, that had a little, quote, pudge around the edges that would wear your ass out, both in skill and endurance. And it was sort of like, wow, man, like everybody, this it's a myth. It's a modern myth.
This makes me think of Jack LaLanne trying to understand the fundamental difference in his approach to health and fitness and appearing lean and achieving that kind of idealized physique versus the Joe Weider inspired approach?
Wow, which is an excellent springboard. Not everybody can be the same type of build or warrior, fighter, athlete. You would never ask somebody who is naturally lean to be a lifter. You would never ask somebody with a genetic predisposition to be big or wide to be a runner. And to judge that is fucking insane. Like, you know, like Polynesian Samoan folks tend to be bigger. Obviously, not always so. But, you know, like, you know, you work with where you're at. Like, people aren't always, this whole idea of being lean. And God damn, if I'm not going back to some of my bullshit that my ancestors do, that the sort of English thing that, oh, you must be thin. Not everybody's fucking thin. Even if they're healthy, they're not thin.
It's really crazy how quickly that paradigm changes, because I think it's in the early 1900s, thin was seen as unhealthy in America. Not that long ago. It's only about 100 years ago that thin was equals unhealthy, because if you see the ads, they're all about trying to gain weight and trying to look healthy by putting on weight. And it's like a complete contradiction to the type of ads we see today in modern, I think even up to the 40s. They're talking, you know, they're pushing weight gainers instead of weight loss as what the trends are leaning towards as far as what defines healthy in the you know, colloquial understanding of what people believe to be healthy.
Back in the Victorian era, people used to do this thing called the tapeworm diet.
Oh, yeah.
And people, it started, there was a resurgence of it not too long ago where people were getting incredibly ill because they would consume, you know, tapeworm eggs, and that's just not good for you.
Wow, that's just a level of insanity I'm not on board with. Fuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's like way too far. That's just, oh.
Well, like, you know, like the idea that you don't ask a fish to run, you don't ask a bird to swim. Like, what? What is healthy for a certain oh God, my biology is failing. It's been a long time. But different body types. Obviously, we'll have different, what is considered, what is it, ectomorphs, endomorphs,
Mesomorph.
yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Like, they're different, man. They're not inferior or superior. They're just different. And God damn it, if America's so goddamn homogenized, one size fits all healthcare and body size and type for everyone, that's fucking horseshit.
Yeah, we definitely don't have a homogenous society. We definitely don't have a homogenous national identity. We don't even have homogenous communities. Like, that's actually a pretty good segue. Earlier in the week, we started discussing, you know, what is the nation? What is a community even? Like, what is this whole, like, identity? And Chris mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. Is that, you know, we're sold this illusion of national identity, but there is no nation out there that fully represents its people 100%. There aren't even communities that are fully 100% homogenous. And so we've got this illusion, this imagined community, this imagined nation, and it's, you know, much to our detriment, it's perpetuated through more aspects of our society than I think people realize.
What I see ending up happening on the global scale and in terms of the application of what we see as the modern interpretation of a nation or a nation state is that the government effectively becomes a lens for translation of fact, theory, and conclusion, because the government essentially creates or generates, and this is at the executive level down to the local level, and even in terms of politics and policy and governmental structure within a corporation or within a town hall or at a school. Essentially, once there's a social interpretation, the factual information or the science tends to be dissociated from the gravity that it carries because there's a translation that's being affected by those lenses. So it's compressed, it's distorted, it's filtered, and then that essentially leads to an irregularity of perception across cultures as they're represented externally in how they face each other as imaginary nations and states.
I think that's spot on in that one of the things that Americans probably don't think about a lot is how much of our media is spent defining other cultures from an American lens, and then these things get reinforced on an executive branch level when you have, the despot in office fucking talking about shithole countries and nasty women only when he's referring to women of color.
Can we refer to him as His Madness King Orange, the Plague Bearer?
I prefer Cheeto Mussolini, but I'm okay with whatever you want to call him.
He who shall not be named. I don't give a fuck.
There we go. That'll work. He who shall not be named.
Regardless, when you have, it's like he's just a modern example of someone who tries to spin the national identity to create a narrative that is based upon the narrative pieces that are out there. But what ends up happening is every government wants to create their own narrative about themselves and about what they perceive as their detractors, we'll call them, because it's not always about an enemy. It can be about just detracting from the unity of the platform or the party. Because in the most extreme cases, you get groupthink to the point where there's no capacity for any sort of outside influence. So a good example is Christian, I won't call him Christian, pseudo biblical wannabe philosophers who call themselves Christian but are actually nothing remotely Christian. They try to establish this framework in which they are exhibiting Christian ideals, but in fact, it's just what their preacher has told them, and by proxy, what their political influence of choice has told them is okay for them to accept within that religious paradigm. Because
it's definitely their echo chamber. I had seen a video blog, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was of Milwaukee, Minnesota, very Nordic of descent, right? And he was blogging, oh, I'm going to Norway, the land of my ancestors. They're Christian. They're this, they're that. The dude goes to Norway and his world falls apart because they're socialist. Even though a lot of Norwegians are very Christian, they're religious, they are, but they're very secular in their attitudes and they're very socialist. And that comes out of a Viking tradition of everybody takes care of everybody.
But Jesus was a socialist. Let's not. Jesus was a socialist. Let's not let these Americans change the narrative, which they're constantly again trying to do. Jesus was literally a socialist. He was an anti-establishment socialist who got people to gather their fucking bread and gather their fish.
Oh yeah.
So he was literally a fucking socialist.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going at. This dude's world fell apart when he goes to Norway, and they're not the super capitalist white Jesus people that he grew up with. Even though obviously they're white Europeans, they're very different from him. And I'll have to look him up later and find his name, but I was just fascinated by it. I was like, wow, your world fell apart because you didn't even bother to look what Norway is like.
Well, but this gets back to the idea that people can believe they're Christian while also being capitalist. You can't be a Christian and capitalist. It doesn't work. It does not work. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you cannot hold those two philosophies in tandem. They do not work together. They are contradictory philosophies when actually applied in practice, because a person who is an actual Christian based on the way that Jesus, like in the book, acted and taught, you can't be a capitalist. He would literally whip your ass if you were a capitalist.
Oh yeah, and Chris, you and I have countless times talked about Joshua. This is my favorite version of Joshua, the real one, chasing the moneylenders from the temple. Full stop.
What's great is that in the past on the show, we've discussed how language defines and at times dictates how somebody establishes context and understanding of their environment, and thereby creates their expectations for how reality is going to present itself to them. And what we're seeing is how narrative is being equated with language. So the narrative becomes the language that people use to interact with their environments. So what happened with your friend is essentially he had been educated with a narrative language that he was using to influence his expectations, or that was even being externally used to influence his expectations of what Norway and what Norwegian language was going to be like. But because he only had an idea of one facet of how the two constructed governments were interacting on an externally facing level, he became disillusioned once his language did not translate into the Norwegian language.
Oh, fair enough. Oh, to be fair, I didn't know this guy. I just watched total strangers, just watched the video blog of this guy.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't take joy. I didn't mean to imply that I took joy from his world falling apart, but I did take joy, at least on the level that, no, dude, you got challenged, right? Like, I don't want you to heartbreak, but if that's what it takes for change, that's what it is.
Well, I think what you're examining is that there are a bunch of people who've never had their worldviews challenged, and they find each other in America and never leave America to never have those worldviews challenged because the media reinforces them instead of challenges them. So this gets back to that whole bubble effect as to if you have Norway is so nebulous in the American media, so that's why it enables people to have their own mental images of what Norway is like. Unless you actually go there, then yeah, you can imagine it's going to be a bunch of white people who are probably undercover Nazis and have these secret schools, and they know they're part of the club. And if you go there, you can little flash a little okay white power sign and get into clubs, and you can imagine it's like that until you go there, and then it's nothing like that. And it's the same shit with Germany. I'm sure a lot of people who never have done the history of Germany assume it's just a bunch of Nazis roaming around.
Oh my God. Talk about a great segue. Thank you, Chris. I spoke with somebody not long ago. Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Norway. They have banned and made illegal certain Nazi symbols, flags. Well, not certain, all of them. Let's be fair, they're all of them. And like people don't get that. Like the stigma of shame that Nordic countries in Germany have from the Third Reich is like these symbols, these flags, these runes are so tainted, even though they were originally Viking, are banned, or rune combinations. Like you can say certain Nazi symbols, and it's hard to do obviously in an audio format, but I'd love to be able to show you the symbols. Okay, this is cool, but this isn't. Like they take it that seriously. Like over here, oh, say whatever you want, whatever, however hateful it is. No, it doesn't roll that way. And it's like, but people don't even know those things are banned. And not just that they're banned on a civil level, they will get you arrested and you will serve jail time for.
I mean, there's countries where you will get criminal repercussions for denying the Holocaust, where I'm saying like America is so far behind modern civilizations under the guise of freedom of speech. That's actually just white supremacy getting a haven in this country. That's again where you like, I want to say American neo-Nazis hate black people more than German Nazis ever exhibited, in that like I can't imagine like American Nazis sharing a space with black people. But that's something where, again, it's like, I think one of the big things about the German Nazis was they were trying to like point to black people to say, hey, we haven't done anything to you. Why are you fighting for Americans? So there's this whole element of like the Americans that now wear the Nazi flag don't even care. I don't even think they care about Nazi Germany. I think they just hate Jewish people. And they're like, oh, these people hate Jews. We're going to wear this Nazi flag. And then that's where they get like, that's how you get people in Indiana wearing a Confederate flag when Indiana was never fucking part of the Confederacy.
God, that's a whole nother can of worms. Well, and I think you and I have talked about before.
I'm saying different. I think it's the same group of people where I'm saying if you're in Indiana and your family is fucking born in Indiana and you're wearing a Confederate flag in the North, in a fucking state that was never part of the fucking Confederacy, and you're also probably hanging out with people who are Nazis, they're just doing this shit to like pick out little aspects of hate groups that they're like, oh, this group hates Nazis or hates Jewish people. This group hates black people. This, and they're like piecemeal going around and picking symbols of hate and not even understanding the fucking origins of those. Cause that's what I'm saying. That's how you end up getting these people using freedom of speech to protect the Nazi flag when that shit's not protected in Germany.
Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in the Olympics in 1936 in Berlin under the Nazi regime. And it was to the great disappointment of the regime because they did believe that black people were, or those who still ascribe to those views, believe black people are inferior.
Yep, but they still, again, it's like that level of interaction is one that I don't think that you would even be able to have that level of interaction with American neo-Nazis.
I would concur, absolutely. I don't think an American neo-Nazi would even come close to entertaining.
And then Chris has just got us into, you want to open up an ugly can of worms with Americans. Fucking Nazis got a lot of fucking bullshit ideas from us, from how the Confederate States operated, how eugenics operated, how fucking Jim Crow operated. And then Americans want to just wash their hands, right? And there's historical documents, and I don't know them exactly right now to quote them, but Hitler's regime looked to other countries' programs, if you will, of racism as templates. And now, his particular brand of anti-Semitism and his evil final solution is, I wouldn't say even uniquely his, because that's born out of hundreds of years of anti-Semitism in Europe. But then he coupled it. He stole American racism, which is an uncomfortable truth that Americans don't want to face up to.
Noam Chomsky actually breaks it down very well in Manufacturing Consent. And he focuses mostly on the progressives of the 19 teens and early 20s, and how they pretty much laid the foundations to the transition into a neoliberal consumer economy, where the goal was to create a consumer cycle which kept people in a state of perpetual keeping up with the Joneses, in a sense. And it also created the kind of social hierarchy that we have now. There were a lot of guys in that era. They were all called progressives for some reason, but they really screwed everybody. I think it was Woodrow Wilson. He was actually one of our presidents who did more to undo the strides and accomplishments of civil rights that black people had made for themselves than almost any other president after the Civil War. Like he did a great job of undoing civil rights.
Well, and then one of the big issues with what helped the Nazi ideas proliferate was the film propaganda. So a lot of the modern day Jewish stereotypes come from these films that were like, create.
Oh wow! I wish I could remember the name of that film. Being a history student, at a technical level, it was a sounding pretty film, but it was absolutely evil. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
I'm trying to find it. Yeah, because there's like a famous filmmaker.
Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will, I think is the name or the film that you're thinking of. Is that it, Chris?
That's one of them. Triumph of the Will is one of them, but there's another one that's like, it's crazy because film classes will use it as an example of like great shots, and you're like, why are you guys using this as if there's nothing else?
Well, if I could be in charge of the class, I'd be like, here's a great example how talented but evil motherfuckers could make a goddamn film and turn it into propaganda that...
Fritz Lang, sorry.
Well, Fritz Lang was like under considerable threat of being executed if he didn't do what he was told.
That's why. Yeah.
He came to America and made a bunch of great movies.
Fritz Lang was Metropolis, right? Like
Yeah.
he was definitely anti-Nazi, as far as I remember.
Oh, he might have been anti-Nazi, but he made so many Nazi propaganda films that it's kind of sickening once you realize like his
Oh my
hand in
God.
spreading the Nazi propaganda. He was part of the machine itself.
Yep.
But he also did contribute to cinema and filmmaking and science
Yep.
fiction in ways that, you know, I'm not trying to you know, wash his hands of his involvement, but he did it with a gun pointed to his head. So,
Yeah.
you know,
It's a very complex scenario
Yeah.
because, again, as you're saying, this is not somebody necessarily.
Oh, sorry, Chris.
No, I was just saying this is not somebody who did this voluntarily with his heart in the ideals of what he was making the films for. It was 100% like under duress.
Yeah, gun to the head. There were people that like
and there's obviously a certain forgiveness for those people who are literally under gunpoint versus like, wow, was it Chris? You and I were talking about Operation Paperclip not long ago, and I remember when I was a young kid, I knew who Werner von Braun was. Did I know that he was a fucking Nazi? No. I only learned that by my early 20s when I finally got into university. Right? Like, not was he just in Nazi Germany. He was a fucking full-on card-carrying Nazi.
Yep.
And we just brought him into our space program. Here you go, Mr. von Braun, which is fucking insane.
Another Nazi propaganda machine was Helene Riefenstahl, also known as Leni Riefenstahl. She made Olympia and Triumph of the Wills.
Oh,
That's the one. She's the one that a lot of people are familiar with for producing the you know, the iconic Nazi propaganda movies. She was a big time Nazi. She lived to be like 100 and something, I think.
well, and the sort of lingering
Let me see.
things
I
that
think
people
it's
don't realize. Hugo Boss.
Yeah, he designed all of their outfits.
Yeah, he designed the SS uniforms, and I'm like,
Not just the
wow.
SS. He was like responsible for the entire Nazi wardrobe.
Yeah, like
His design company was. He might not have done all of the designs himself, but he signed off on it, and he got the check and he cashed it.
Yeah, and then people go on about, oh, the icon of Coco Chanel. I'm like, do you know her story? Like, she was a Nazi collaborator. Like, it's fucking awful.
Yeah, I think that's also why it's important to examine how these things have been sewn into our system, where now it's like, you know, NASA has done a lot of questionable shit. Obviously, they are deeply tied in with the military industrial complex, not as much as like DARPA, but you know, in knowing the history of where NASA came from, it's like I as someone who loves space and loves science have a hard time not wanting them to be
Clean.
scrutinized with like a fine tooth comb 100% of the time, because I don't trust them. I don't trust their ethics. Like even though they're the least military industrial inclined organization that we know of as far as part of our government, I still don't trust them motherfuckers because they're born of Nazis.
So there's a show on Amazon called Hunters, and it's about a group of assassins led by you know, Jewish interests It's post World War II. It takes place in the 70s, and they hunt down high profile Nazis in America, and Werner von Braun is one of them. But they make one Nazi woman eat shit. That was quite awesome to watch, and there are all these. They do a great job of making the Nazi characters just absolutely despicable, despisable. And they're old people. They're not. They're it's kind of innocuous. You wouldn't even think it's like, oh, this is a Nazi. It's just some old dude in America or some old lady. But once they reveal, once they're revealed by the hunters, and they have to drop the act.
Oh,
I'll just say
it's
that
night and day, right?
the writers and the actors did a phenomenal job of creating an interpretation of characters that is so despicable. You just, as a viewer, you just want them to go in some excruciatingly horrible way, and the directors, they deliver in spades. It was fantastic. I haven't been so pleased watching people get murked on TV in a TV show in so long. Like, and there's like, they don't hold back. I mean, this is some pretty graphic, like bloody as can be. There's some superhuman moments where somebody gets shot and they can keep walking and they haven't like dropped the contents of their pants or anything like that. But
well, you know that like we ended up obviously sadly with Werner von Braun. The Russians, and it was, I guess, the Soviets at the time, because it was the USSR. They ended up with the other half of the Nazi burgeoning space program. Like, that's a crazy thing, Chris. You go back to the idea. The Nazis were technically the first nation to get a rocket into space. Now, to be fair, it only broke the atmosphere and came back. But it's kind of scary. Only when I was in college and in a university, how technologically advanced the Nazis were over everybody fucking else. Like, they had taken, if you see the old footage, and going back to the 36 Olympics? A camera that was able to broadcast was gigantic. By the 40s, before they had lost, they took that same technology, miniaturized it, and Werner von Braun, who is in charge of the what was that rocket program? I can't remember the name. But they were, blasting missiles at Britain, and not so successfully, and sometimes successfully. They put cameras in them, and they were literally like a quarter of the size, and they were able to broadcast. And even America did not admit to some of the technological advancements that the Nazis had made, because they thought it would sort of what the phrase I'm looking for, hurt morale, I guess, if you will, right?
So I believe that rocket you were discussing was the V2 rocket.
Thank you. I couldn't remember. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah, no problem. But yes, to your point, the fact that the regime or the Reich was able to proliferate such technologically advanced material and essentially gather all of the scientific minds under one umbrella and keep them motivated to creating this, essentially this weaponry and these tools that were designed predominantly for the goal of domination just demonstrates the influence that they held in their imperialistic ambitions.
I don't know if most people are aware that, I don't know, and you guys have probably seen the footage of even Nazi submarines had made it to the coast of New York and New Jersey and literally took film. They broke surface and took film of the New York and New Jersey skylines. And it's like, I guess where I'm going with this is that once again, capitalism rears its ugly head. At the end of the war, we're not all like, well, we do need to defeat the Nazis, but we also need their technology. No matter how much blood that technology cost, how much genocide had to occur to get it, America wanted it at all costs. And we brought it back. The diving, people don't realize too, like I saw a documentary about how we treat what's it called? It's a diving illness.
The bends?
Yes, thank you. The bends, in part, came from evil and unethical experiments that Mengele did on Jewish folks just to see what would happen. We gathered that data and we're like, oh, this causes the bends because he was messing with atmospheric pressures. And it's just like, shit, we're diabolic.
Well, back to the concept of that period of time and those personalities influencing American popular culture as well. There's the film with Dustin Hoffman, Marathon Man. I'm not sure if you've seen that film, but it's essentially about somebody who lives in New York City, and there is a hidden Nazi living in New York City who has a brother who was experimenting on Jews in concentration camps, who lives in South America. And this brother who lives in New York City has been tasked with keeping watch over a supply or a safety deposit box that has diamonds in it. And he dies in a car accident, and it leads to his brother having to leave hiding in South America and come to the United States. And there's significant intrigue and interaction between him and, I believe, Dustin Hoffman's character is Jewish as well. And there's a grand confrontation between the two of them, and instances where this Nazi doctor is recognized on the streets by Holocaust survivors. So there's definitely the catharsis to be had from a popular culture perspective in regards to confronting the truths of that history and trying to present it as a reality to be present within the collective consciousness of the consumer culture as well.
Then it becomes those cathartic media representations that end up not necessarily defining the people, but I think there becomes a danger of then having those people's existence defined by those media representations, because the same thing happens with Black people in slavery, in that most of the media depictions about Black people like end up being about American Black history, which is always effectively slavery or some point in which Black people are still subjugated or servants to then make these feel-good rebellion stories, which often involve white saviors, or if there's no white savior, the black person is going to have to probably like fight other black people in the process. That
or engage in some sort of self-sacrificial act.
Yeah.
Like there isn't a happy ending or there isn't a survival.
No, black people don't get happy endings in this country, and that's one of those things that it sounds innocuous, but when you look at how then that shapes black culture and the capacity for individuals to develop identity in that culture, then there is no real capacity for black people to not be seen through a victim lens, because that's the only one that's being presented by the media. So it's like a black person cannot be a victim, but anything that black person does will be seen as if they're trying to portray themselves as a victim, because that's the only way the media portrays black people in general. And that's like, you know, when black people want representation in media, it's like we just want our range of life experiences put on display in the same manner as all of the struggle stories, because as far as it seems, the struggle stories get the most attention, as what it becomes a chicken and egg, as if black people only enjoy struggle stories because those are the only ones that get any attention.
And what you're saying is not at all a large ask. It's perfectly reasonable, feasible, and the media machines and corporations are perfectly capable of producing stories like that if they so wanted on a large scale. What we talked about earlier in the show this evening was about the influence of the externally facing government lens of the policy, the culture. And I think that there's a distinct connection between that and media representation, because that narrative needs to be perpetuated somehow. And the perpetual story that you've touched upon is part of a narrative that benefits a specific subset of people who are responsible for creating, generating, and producing a specific kind of intellectual entertainment that is a consistent generator of ideas that shape people's social interactions. And because the ask of creating a more equitable representation and a different narrative within the media on a broad scale for Black people is because it may be, it's not a difficult ask to produce if they wanted to, but if they did, it would require them to significantly shift the narratives that they are entertaining people with and that people have grown accustomed to, and it might affect their bottom line.
Wow, it just, you made me think of I think both Chris and I had posted something. I was complaining about the whole and Chris also too was complaining about the whole ancient aliens bullshit.
Oh God. Okay, I'm gonna put the ancient aliens slideshow back up. 1 second.
Yeah, right. And I was thinking, man, I was like, it would be cool to actually see a film of, well, let's be honest, it would be African folks building the pyramids, because like the Sudan region, which would be considered the upper kingdom of Egypt, has more pyramids than the lower kingdoms. And it's interesting, and I thought of Chris when I think about this, when I explain it to other people, you'd be like, the Nile runs from south to north. The upper kingdoms are the south. Like, and when you start to read more of the accurate history of that area, all the upper kingdom folks were sub-Saharan Black. And the lower kingdom folks were a mixture, because the Egyptians didn't really, the ancient Egyptians, to be fair, as far as we know, didn't have a hang up about skin color. And a lot of them were either black, Semitic, or a mixture of the two. And even in writings, which you have original documents, and by say original source documents, literally written on walls or papyrus, a lot of folks bragged about having Upper Kingdom bloodlines. And I try to put that against the mirror of late 1800 white-centric assholes coming into Egypt. Oh, these had to be light-skinned white people that built all this shit because only us have mathematics. I'd be like, no, dude, some really dark-skinned men and women built this shit and are more advanced than you, even now.
And part of it was that conversation was always, they were always trying to place those advanced or the development paradigms against each other, and had to leave China out of the conversation in the process too, because then it makes the West look ridiculous.
Yeah, right?
That's development trajectory compared to China or like really the old kingdoms. And that's why the old kingdoms have had their, or the upper kingdoms rather, have had their histories disconnected, because then when you understand like African histories are not as disconnected as African American history is. That's why they only tell you stories about African American slaves, because once you start getting the African stories, then all the shit they try to tell you about American history just looks ridiculous and absurd. You can't start to learn about the history of the African continent without realizing that most of Western history is like a constructed lie based around some theft that happened at some point.
Most of Western history happens in less than 1/5 of the total time China has had a recorded history,
right? Like,
and
that's
that, and
right?
it exists in like 1/10 of Africa's history that we've dug up in the ground. Like the audacity of the West to not include China in the development framework is, well, it's just highlighted by the fact that the United States has to engage in applying sanctions against China because China is out innovating the United States with technology developed in the United States. Like, that's the part that just makes me wonder, like, are these people even paying attention? Don't they realize that like all their showboating is put them in this place where their manufacturing center can outdo them now? And it just blows my mind.
Yeah, I think he just highlighted, man, the snake eating its tail, obviously. But then you get people, you get like one of the stupid things I've heard recently. I mean, not me, but the notion of like, if Joe Biden wins, everybody's going to have to learn Chinese. There are so many racist things about that sentiment, and things that are disconnected from reality in a way that let me first off say there are more people who speak English in China technically than there are Americans, period. Just period. They may not be speaking at the fluency proficiency, but I'm talking about people who can say English words, construct English sentences, use Google Translate in 2020 because everything is assisted. There are more of those people than there are Americans.
When I was in China 15 years ago, everywhere we went, if I asked somebody a question, they would respond in English. Literally everywhere we went, somebody could speak English.
Because their education system is good enough that
even the people who get poor educations can speak English.
Yeah, and that's where again it's like because the level of education distribution is so high compared to ours, like the information access puts them at a point where, as I'm saying, there are more English speakers in China at just a level of saying yes, they can access the language than there are Americans, period. Now, with the notion of somehow we're going to all have to learn Chinese, that is some like China already owns a significant portion of our debt, and there's no mandates for Americans to learn anything. Like there's no national language, period. So English isn't even a national language because we don't have a national language. That's just something that people assume. So then there's this whole notion of like, oh, then well, they don't force you to learn English. It's just what people do because nobody really questions traditions enough to change things. So that's where again, this is like there's a lot of things about the racist right wing rhetoric that is going around right now about people having to learn Chinese that is just obviously nowhere in touch with reality, but it's just racist. There's
Yeah, and it
about
just made me think of the dynamic. You just, besides busting their ass about that racist shit, you just want to look at them and be like, do you know how fucking close
Oh, wow.
the United States was to speaking Spanish, which is a language they seem to fucking hate? And it's like right wingers, right? Like,
yeah.
you're just like, Jesus Christ, dude, what is your problem?
Many
It's like,
Spanish names.
we were this fucking close to speaking Spanish predominantly versus English.
So, as of this moment, there are at least 260 million registered students in China, and they are all required to learn English. And this doesn't include the
Oh
number.
my god.
That doesn't include the
Wow.
that doesn't include the number of people who have already completed school and already speak English.
That's
It,
For the last decade, at least, English is a required secondary language in China.
Oh, and I bet they know more English rules than fucking people in rural America too.
oh yeah, they do. They got better
Well,
diction and punctuation and syntax.
China has significant interests in real estate in the United States as well.
Yeah.
They've in recent years or in recent decades even increased their holdings of commercial and private real estate in city centers, basically large city environments where there's a lot of business to be made and also a lot of ways to invest cash readily and handily. But if we think about the potential evolution of that paradigm, and of course, this is also partial conjecture. I mean, if there's going to be a significant amount of businesses in the United States that face American consumers that also have vested interests in people who studied in China, who grew up in China, were born in China, then it would stand to reason that there would also be a need or an impetus for learning English as a language of commerce.
I think that's definitely the impetus for a lot of English speaking programs in that the paradigm used to be French up until I think the early 1800s or is it early or late 1800s.
It was pretty much split, but leaning definitely towards French. You're absolutely right. It was colonial, like, sadly, colonial languages, right? Like
it was down to is the leading colonial forces are going to dictate the international trade languages. So when France was more heavily involved in colonialism, non-colonized countries would learn French to trade with those colonies.
Well, this is a strange springboard for me, and sort of my story of life. The first time I went to Scotland, which represents about 50% of my ancestry, I had never, even into my late 40s, had heard Scots Gaelic spoken. And it's kind of a testament in the world that we live in. I've heard Italian, I've heard German, I've heard Mandarin, I've Chinese, I've heard Cantonese Chinese, I've heard Japanese, I've heard Russian, God, and a few other languages, right? I never had heard the language that some of my ancestors had spoke. And it was so tear-inducing. I was kind of, I admit, weepy when I turned on a BBC channel and they were broadcasting live in Scots Gaelic and hearing people speak it, like, right? It was like, wow. And that was sort of my strange teaching moment. Okay, this language and this aspect of my identity and my culture had been sort of not stolen, but just sort of erased gently over time. And voluntarily is the key point. And I had this moment where I had to sit down. And even though you think on a cognitive level as just an older white dude, yeah, slavery sucks. The stealing of culture and genocide and the transatlantic slave trade sucks and it's diabolic and it has repercussions. On this weird level, man, I was like, I'm feeling emotional about a language. And then I was like, there are Black dudes that have never heard Swahili. Not because they were erased voluntarily, but because they were stolen. And the power of ripping a language from somebody is immense outside of the other obvious evil that has happened. And I'm just like, the stealing of culture is absolutely diabolic. Even just to have it sort of forgotten voluntarily pulls on your heartstrings. But to sit and think, these things were forcibly stolen from people. Was just like, wow, I can't.
The United States isn't even in the top 10 percentage of population that speaks English.
It sounds crazy. It sounds crazy, but it's true.
6, 7, 8,
sounds
9,
crazy.
10, 11, 12, 13. It's number 13.
Like that's
13?
It sounds crazy when you think about it, like, or when you hear it at first, because of these people who identify being American so much with speaking English. We don't own this fucking language, and we're not even the biggest country that speaks it. It is like, it's insane how much American identity is so constructed and fake and built around the patriarchy that is basically trying to shield itself. There's just so much about the English language that the American English language specifically, that is, again, American English will end up allowing you to think that American English is somehow the most English.
It's also
Right?
it's number 14 as the first language. And
What is it?
number 14 as one's first language.
Oh wow.
Like, Chris, I know you've been to the UK too. Like, even hearing and engaging in other dialects of English is kind of an amazing thing. Like, right? Like, people don't get that here.
Yeah.
Unless they leave.
Hey, there's definitely different dialects in America, but they are more the regional dialects in America have a lot more to do with expressions and idioms, it seems like, than there's accents too, even, because it's like the East Coast dialect is going to be different the farther north you go, and then there's going to be a point where that um, uh, Boston accent disappears completely, and the New York tri-state region accent starts to take over, which is slightly different, but that's going to sound the same from somebody who's in the Midwest who has non-regional Dixon or non-regional dialect compared to somebody who's from the region who drags the A's, It's like I can't even do it off the top of my head.
Oh, park the car in the car park.
No,
Yeah, you park your car, you bastard.
like
That's New England. That's Boston.
Yeah, you don't say the R's. Like they're just completely dropped.
Again, there's just so many different American dialects that end up having these weird regional variations that it's like it's similar to the New England dialect, but it's like just slightly off, because like when you go to Wisconsin, they drag them in a different way up in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
like,
don't you know?
And then there's the affected Mid-Atlantic accent.
Yeah, there's so many random accents that until you hear, like, oh, I guess there's a whole lot of variation within America, but the variation is like it's like these little regional. Then when you see they like don't actually add anything to the language, it's just to show that person's from that region.
Even Texas has multiple regional accents.
Well, like when you shift from, oh my God, I remember being in Nottingham, England. And this is the funniest thing, man. We were at a pub with my friends, and there was a particular bottle of scotch on the wall. And it is so weird to me that there were people in England that couldn't wrap their mind around my accent. But I've been around enough English folks and Scots, I understand them. And I asked, I was like, hey, I want that bottle of Jura, which is Jura is an island, right? And the lady behind the bar just looks at me like I'm from Mars, instinctively. I was like, the island of Jura, right behind you, because I was in Scotland for a while. She understood that accent, and I my friends were just laughing hysterically. They're like, you actually had to adapt with the Scot accent so an English person could understand you. And that's back to Dan's point. It's sort of like the weird sort of power of language and dialect, right? Like there's some people that just shut their brains off and they just can't even understand another accent, even though it's really similar, sort of. But saying that, I get it. Like a small difference is a huge gap sometimes.
Or the perception of language or the accent is ascribed to a particular narrative about a people. For instance, the transatlantic accent was an affected accent in the early 20th century that upper class people and people in the entertainment industry cobbled together from the British and American accents to try and differentiate themselves from people who they perceive to be in a lower societal standing than them. And then it's basically, it could also be used as a form of segregation, a way to treat somebody as less than because they speak a certain way.
Absolutely. It's referred to, I've heard it called the triangle accent, the BBC accent, which is an accent that's cultivated in England. Well, which is considered like posh BBC accent. versus like somebody from Birmingham, which is called a Brummie, which I cannot do their accents, or somebody from Liverpool, and the most famous accent of that, hey, Paul, you know, the Beatles. And then you move into Scottish accents, which are differentiate from Glasgow to Elgin or Edinburgh, which are very distinctive accents. And it is so interesting. It depends on where you are, whether or not people either have the patience or the disposition, if you will, to understand your accent. Right? Like they just either they don't want to or they genuinely can't. And then you run into what I call the boomhauer effect. There's a boomhauer in every fucking country. And I've ran into them in Scotland and England. I remember me and a Scottish friend of mine were in Fort William, and there were these two old English guys. One of them was totally, you could totally understand him. His buddy, both of us, all of us were like, did you understand him? And we're all scratching our heads.
Well, you bring up the very interesting and salient point that within a country or within a nation that has its narrative defining the use of a language to create concepts and influence people's internal philosophies contains within it a broad range of dialects of the same phonetic structure that people use to then create contexts about each other within the construct that has been created by the externally facing government and the media corporation.
Well, even down to this gets back to why some words are more fun to say than others, because their actual sounds and constructions have aesthetic qualities that are pleasing in some cases, and some then other words will have aesthetic qualities that are harsh and abrasive in other cases. And I think this is why, especially when we have media depictions of other language, like the easiest way to know that we're dealing with a German person is to have the German language spoken in an extremely harsh and abrasive, rigid, emotional or unemotional manner. And that's how we identify what we know as German speaking. And in that, there's only going to be so much capacity for nuance in Americans' range of understanding the different accents locally, let alone around the world. So that's where, you get maybe one accent per country, two if you're lucky, three if it's a country with a lot of white people, like maybe more than three, because you got like enough Americans know at least two different British accents, because that's where it's like they may not know the same two, but Americans will generally be familiarized with at least two different British accents based on our media, like information dissemination. But I struggle to imagine Americans know more than one. Like, we know, there's Mandarin and Cantonese. Surely that's not the end of the difference in dialect. There's going to be different dialects amongst those breakdowns, but Americans aren't going to be able to learn any of that stuff relatively to like know what they talk like in the Guangzhou region versus Shenzhen. And it's like that type of difference is not, Americans won't have any sort of context to know that, but that's probably something that somebody who's familiar would be like, yeah, that's easy to tell the difference.
You got the standard Chinese, you got the Beijing dialect, you got the Penang Hokkien, Hokkien, Middle Chinese, Suzhou dialogue, Yonghuan Sheng, Dapeng dialect, Weitou, Yilugan, Datangan, Yingyigan, Wuhan dialect, Shaishan, Putan dialect, The list goes on. Northern Mandarin, Fuan, Harbin, Hangzhou, Qingtan, no, Qingtian, Kuzhou, Xianyu,
Yeah,
uh,
right. Like, I mean,
Shichi.
to be fair, I have not heard those and have been around them, but I can appreciate them because I've been around a lot of Arab speakers, right? And the idea that, like, somebody from Egypt, for example, you were talking about dialect. The Arabic technically doesn't have a hard G sound like a G, but Egyptians put it in there. Modern day Egyptians, like, where like a Gulf state Arab from, say, Saudi Arabia would say Jamal, Gamal. Well, Jamal, camel, right? The Egyptians would say Gamal, which is where stupid ass English dudes misheard it and got the word camel, right? Like, and that's just one of many different like things in dialect, like, and you can hear it in their accents and how they speak their Arabic or when they speak their English. And it's just like, just listen, man. Like, even a language varies, even with 100, 200 miles. And of course, China being massive, anybody with half a brain, which I'm probably giving more credit to most Americans, like, of course, there's going to be this amazing and diverse and beautiful variation of language and dialect, but it's lost. Like Chris said, like, even German, we've reduced, when you watch American media, Germans are reduced to all German sounding the same, but Austrian German is different than Bavarian German, which is different than German, or even Swiss German. And I want to stray away from white examples. When you go from like Japanese spoken in Osaka is different than Japanese spoken in Tokyo or Hokkaido. It's just like, wow, it's an arrogance that I think Americans have.
It's funny you bring up Swiss German because that specific example, like I can speak French, but when I hear Swiss German, it feels like I can understand it, but it's like right on the other side of
It's on the other
being,
side of that
being
boot.
what's up?
Oh, it's on the other side of a butte.
That's what it feels like, but when I hear German, it's on the other side of a gorge.
Oh,
Like that's the difference between Swiss German and German, where like I feel like I could throw a rock and understand Swiss German, but I would need like a plane ride to understand German.
Well, it's funny the two that you say that, Chris, because like Scots Gaelic, which they call it Gaelic, I'm not just being pedantic, and Irish Gaelic, they can understand each other. I have heard very little of it spoken and only know a few phrases, but they can work through it. And I've heard people who speak Swiss German are able to talk to Germans, but it takes work. It does take work.
Yeah, and even the visual construction, it's like similar but slightly off because I've been to Germany. I've never been to Switzerland, but I was able to navigate my way around Germany not easily, but I did it. Whereas I tried to help a Swiss German with tech help, and his phone was like completely unintelligible. Where I feel like if it was German, I would not have had the same problem. So there's these points where I've been confronted with the language to see, like, yes, there's a slight nuance to even somebody who can't speak either.
close the show. Chris, close the show.
So yeah, I think this is a good, the idea of we're at a point where our languages are more accessible and allow us to connect to others as long as we're putting in the effort to learn those languages and connect with the people, this is the perfect time to be bridging gaps and not building walls. In our capacity to learn and understand languages with Google and other translators is helping. So this is a good time to be alive, y'all.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.